In the Me Too era, nearly any expression of male heterosexual desire can be defined as assault, or at least harassment, if the woman finds it so. How did we get to the point in an age of supposed liberation where some feminists have succeeded in equating sex with harm to women? That's my subject on today's Flamingo File. Janice Flamingo of the University of Ottawa. In the traditional view that pertained in Western culture for centuries, sex was seen as destructive to social flourishing outside of love and procreation within marriage. According to this view, women needed to be protected from men whose sexual drive was understood to be far more powerful than women's. In traditional Western society, women who became pregnant outside of marriage had no socially acceptable means to guarantee the well-being of their children. The marital bond was meant to tame male sexuality by directing it toward one woman and to guarantee support for the woman and her children. Second-wave feminism was, in the 1960s, a rejection of this arrangement. Feminists saw the family as a patriarchal strategy, not for the protection of women, but for their confinement. Marriage, according to feminists, was about the control of female, not male, sexuality, and feminists were irritated by the belief that the female sexual drive was any less powerful than the male. That was simply a myth, they claimed, to justify women's subjugation. Traditional sexual morality, according to second-wave feminist pioneers, was a means to deny women their sexual pleasure. Even as late as 2010, a major architect of second-wave feminism, Gloria Steinem, gave voice to this idea when she said in an interview that, quote, all the various kinds of patriarchies have one thing in common, and that is controlling women's bodies as the means of reproduction. It gives a patriarch ownership of children through paternity, end quote. What she didn't also mention, of course, is that under patriarchy and still today, men have had the responsibility to financially support women and the children they fathered in marriage, a responsibility that feminists insist men maintain to this day, even in cases where the man is not married to the mother of the children, and even cases where he has no contact with those children, or even where they are not actually his children. In a typical feminist double standard, women are to be liberated from the bonds of conventional morality. They're not to be shamed for being sexual outside of marriage, but men are not to be liberated from their bonds as providers. In rejecting patriarchal morality, Gloria Steinem and her colleagues claimed that women's liberation was inseparable from their sexual liberation. They focused on the pursuit of sexual pleasure for women, which they alleged was just as important to women as it was to men. Women were urged to initiate sexual advances and to enjoy sex in the same way men enjoyed it. Powered by the birth control pill, which was first made widely available in the 1960s, and by the feminist critique of marriage, the sexual revolution was born. But early on, some feminists sounded a dark warning, alleging that it was not so easy for women to liberate themselves, and that in fact, heterosexuality itself, whether within or outside of marriage, was an arena in which male domination of women was enacted. Radical feminists such as Sheila Jeffreys, Andrea Dworkin, and Catherine McKinnon developed theories in the 1970s that emphasized not liberation, but female subordination. And these theories, marginal at first and still highly contested amongst feminists today, gained widespread credence in academia and in the front lines of feminist activism. From that place in academia, such theories spread throughout the culture, infiltrating journalism, entertainment, advertising, law, and social policy in ways that have created a remarkable stalemate over sex that will have long-lasting repercussions. Fundamentally, the radical feminist claim is that there is no measurable difference between normal sex and sexual violence, and that in fact normal sex is violent. The result in 2019 is the massive expansion of the definition of sexual assault, which can now include nearly any kind of unwanted touching, even on a woman's clothed body, and of sexual harassment, which can now include nearly any unwelcome attention on the part of a man toward a woman. In 1989, Harvard professor of law Catherine MacKinnon encapsulated the theory in an article published in the journal Ethics with the title Sexuality, Pornography, Method, Pleasure Under Patriarchy. In this definitive article, MacKinnon summed up her argument as follows, quote, "Compare victims' reports of rape with women's reports of sex. They look a lot alike," end quote. She concluded, "In this light, the major distinction between intercourse, normal, and rape, abnormal, is that the normal happens so often that one cannot get anyone to see anything wrong with it," end quote. Outrageous, bizarre, but MacKinnon was not a crackpot raving on a street corner. She was a highly articulate, credentialed legal theorist who framed her ideas in sophisticated-seeming arguments. Her thesis statement was notable, amongst other reasons, for admitting that getting people to see something wrong with normal sex was a feminist goal. In 1990, lesbian feminist Sheila Jeffreys published her book Anti-Climax, a feminist perspective on the sexual revolution, in which she argued that the sexual revolution was in fact directly contrary to women's liberation, designed to eroticize female subordination and thus to diffuse the potential threat to male power created by women's economic emancipation in the 60s. She said, quote, "Behind the baloney of liberation, the naked power politics of male supremacy were being acted out," end quote. For Jeffreys, the entire basis of heterosexual desire is the eroticization of inequality. In her words, quote, "In heterosexual desire, our subordination becomes sexy," end quote. I don't think it would be too much of a simplification to say that the Me Too movement is the popular realization of MacKinnon's and Jeffreys' once outlier theories in their focus on sex itself as a harm to women. To elide the distinction between sex and violence, the Me Too movement redefines consent as non-consent in all sorts of ways and argues that even consensual sex hurts at least some and perhaps all women. One striking popular example of the redefining of consent can be seen in Monica Lewinsky's claim in the February 2018 issue of Vanity Fair that she has rethought her involvement with Bill Clinton. Now, as everyone knows, Lewinsky was the White House intern who found herself at the center of a political firestorm when President Clinton lied about their sexual affair in the White House. Up until 2018, to my knowledge, Lewinsky never claimed that the affair was anything but consensual, but in the wake of Me Too, she has recast her involvement with the president using the familiar language of feminist victimology. She says, quote, "I now see how problematic it was that the two of us even got to a place where there was a question of consent." This was her statement in the Vanity Fair interview. She went on, quote, "Instead, the road that led there was littered with inappropriate abuse of authority, station, and privilege," end quote. Well, obviously the inappropriate abuse that she refers to is not hers, but Bill Clinton's alone. This is a fairly remarkable turnaround for the woman who admitted in an interview with Barbara Walters to feeling flattered by Clinton's interest and to actually showing the president her thong underwear as an explicit sexual invitation. But the turnaround isn't all that surprising for anyone who's followed even 1/10 of the Me Too movement, which is incapable of seeing women as anything but helpless victims of male power. And by the way, I'm not unsympathetic to Lewinsky. I think her public exposure at that time was cruel. But her born-again feminism offers an all too predictable script into which we now watch her trying to force her experience. In general, it's clear that the Me Too movement involves a dramatic walk back of what feminist leaders have said for years about yes means yes and no means no. Now, yes does not necessarily mean yes anymore. It doesn't mean yes if the woman has been drinking and has been deemed unable to consent. It doesn't mean yes if there's any kind of power differential in the relationship. It doesn't mean yes if the woman regrets her decision to be sexual. Now the net of unhappy and degrading and damaging sex is being cast ever more widely to include the nominally consensual, with the result that, as Catherine McKinnon hoped, much normal sex is being redefined as abuse. Even when there isn't any power differential between the woman and the man, the Me Too emphasis is on the many ways that a woman's yes can actually be interpreted as non-consensual. Recently, the New York Times published an article by columnist Jessica Bennett, their gender editor, called "When Saying Yes is Easier Than Saying No," in which Bennett writes about what she calls the gray areas of consent, which include, in her words, quote, begrudgingly consensual sex because, you don't really want to do it, but it's probably easier to just get it over with. Lukewarm sex because you're kind of meh about it. And of course, bad sex, where the bad refers not to the perceived pleasure of it, but to the way you feel in the aftermath. That's the end of that quote. At first, this statement seems like it might lead to a frank discussion about what women really want from sex and relationships and the difficulty at least some women seem to have in knowing and articulating that. But then it falls back into the most cliched of laments when Bennett claims that, quote, women have been taught by every cultural force imaginable that we must be nice and quiet and polite, that we must protect others' feelings before our own, that we are there for others' pleasure, end quote. And we're back to Feminism 101, the patriarchal conspiracy theory and women's supposed powerlessness. Now, in 1958, Bennett's assertion might have had some truth, but in 2018, it was a misrepresentation of embarrassing proportions, as anyone knows who has eyes to see. Every advertisement, hashtag, public service announcement, and educational slogan encourages women to think about their needs and desires above all. If some, or even many women, still do want to be wanted more than they want sex itself, and I agree that at least some women do, it's very hard to blame that on society. But having opened a can of worms about women who lie about their desire, Bennett can only move in the direction McKinnon laid out, spinning justifications for yes not really meaning yes. She approves the idea that women can't consent if they've been drinking alcohol, even though alcohol is what a lot of women drink when they want and intend to be sexual. And Bennett wants to go even further than that. She says, quote, what about a woman who doesn't feel that she can speak up because of cultural expectations? Should that woman be considered unable to consent too, end quote? So 50 years into the modern feminist movement, elite feminist opinion makers are openly declaring that women cannot be responsible for knowing their desire or saying what they mean. A movement that supposedly began with women's quest for freedom and self-determination has rather quickly become about blaming patriarchy for women's moral cowardice. Even sex within marriage, or perhaps especially sex within marriage, is in the feminist crosshairs. Last year, Vox magazine published a long op-ed entitled, "We Need to Talk About Sexual Assault in Marriage Too." But the subject isn't actually sexual assault. Describing years in an unhappy marriage, the anonymous author who teaches, you guessed it, feminist theory at an American university, claims that she was violated every time she and her husband had sex, even though the sex was consensual. Submitting to her husband left her, quote, "sexually traumatized long after I ended that marriage," she claims. It certainly sounds very unpleasant, and of course it's all the fault of the patriarchy. The author claims that, quote, "all the feminist texts I had read could not drown out what I had absorbed from society and popular culture, that it was my duty to satisfy my husband regardless of my own feelings," end quote. But she obviously didn't make any real attempt to satisfy her husband. On the contrary, it seems that she went out of her way to humiliate and rub his nose in the fact that sex with him repulsed her. She tells us that she insisted on reading a book during sex and never allowed her husband to kiss her on the lips, and that this state of things went on for years. The entire piece reads far more like a overwritten gender studies agitprop assignment than like any true confession, and it's pretty obviously a piece of feminist theater. What man could go through with such a farce? What could possibly have been the source of this deep sexual disgust for a man the author claims she once loved and wasn't ready to leave? And why are we being told all this? The repeated refrain in the article is that we need to talk about this more. Apparently, we need to hear more from resentful women complaining about bad sex, more from women who loathe sex with their husbands, because Me Too has become a great howl of bad feelings about men, and that needs to be kept going, an ever-expanding grievance machine. I wouldn't be surprised to learn that the American professor of feminist theory who wrote that Vox article had read a chapter by professor of law and philosophy Robin West called Sex, Law, and Consent. Published in 2008, this chapter is available online and as part of a book called The Ethics of Consent Theory and Practice. And I would recommend everyone take a look at this if you want to see where Me Too and modern feminism are heading, in my opinion. Professor Robin West argues that feminist theory needs to take more seriously the harms to women of what she defines as consensual but unwelcome sex, which is sex where the woman has given a yes that really should have been a no. She argues that, quote, "consensual sex, when it is unwanted and unwelcome, often carries harms to the personhood, autonomy, integrity, and identity of the person who consents to it, and these harms are unreckoned by law and more or less unnoticed by the rest of us," end quote. Now, according to West, not unlike the worker who does his job under stressful and dangerous conditions, a woman who consents to sex she doesn't want, even if she fully consents and is not subordinate or incapacitated, is alienated in the Marxian sense from her own self. Professor West also states, ominously in my opinion, that, quote, "legal theorists should focus more than we do on consensual sexual harms and their relation to law in the intimate sphere." I think that bears repeating. Consensual sexual harms and their relation to law in the intimate sphere. Wow. West is not, perhaps not yet, arguing that unwanted consensual sex should be criminalized, but she definitely wants to make it at the least a subject of extensive discussion, and indeed, as we see 10 years later, it is now a subject of discussion in Vox magazine, scripted to Professor West's near-exact specifications. Actually, one of the scenarios that West mentioned in her chapter is a woman in a marriage having unwanted sex over a period of years. The clear suggestion in both West's theoretical analysis and the anonymous Vox magazine article is that a case of unwelcome, though consensual sex is not merely a personal experience best left to individuals to deal with on their own. No, consensual but unwelcome sex deserves to become a social and perhaps legal category, not unlike sexual assault, a part of our public discourse, a subject of feminist analysis and grievance, and of course, another tool of male shaming and control of male sexuality. Neither West nor any of the other feminists I've read ever considers the harms to men of being trapped in sexless marriages in which their wives have checked out sexually and emotionally, which the brilliant Bettina Arndt has spoken about in depth. I don't think feminists ever seriously think about the men whose longing for sex is a fact of their lives that has nothing to do with power or abuse, or who themselves have unwelcome sex with women. No, feminists have come to believe that most men are like the husband in the Vox article, a cardboard caricature without any higher feeling or self-respect. And women have been taught from childhood to see sex with men exactly as Robin West describes the experience of Marx's alienated worker: dirty, repetitive, unfulfilling, body and soul deforming labor. And now Me Too has sent out the call, let's go after all the bastards. The result is increased anger and resentment on the part of women and increased social stigma against men for a variety of non-criminal behavior, including asking for sex with their wives and girlfriends. In my opinion, this is the terrifying direction in which Me Too is heading, to define more and more categories of unhappy female experience as male sexual abuse. A key plank of the feminist agenda has always been to give women the power, backed by social, state, and legal sanction, to determine the nature of every interaction, sexual and non-sexual, between men and women. The power to define reality is the greatest power it is possible to have. And feminism's endgame, not that far from being realized, will render men near voiceless in both the public and private spheres.